For years, Lakewood Church looked untouchable, a giant in modern faith, packed seats, global broadcasts, and a message warm enough to fill an arena every week. But behind the lights, something else was happening, something slower and harder to see. Critics noticed the shift first, then former members, then the headlines. The deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. This wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a quiet drift, away from the cross and towards something far more comfortable. And once you see that drift, it's impossible to unsee, because everything that followed traces back to it. For years, Lakewood Church looked untouchable, a giant in modern faith. Tens of thousands walking through its doors, millions more watching from home, and a message warm enough to pack an arena week after week. From the outside, it felt perfect, smooth, successful, unshakable. But behind the lights, something else was taking shape. Not a scandal, not a crisis. Something slower, quieter, and harder to see. People who had been there for decades began to sense a change. Former members spoke about a shift they couldn't explain at first. Critics pointed to a pattern that didn't fit the church's past. And soon, the questions started rising faster than anyone expected. Because when you look closely, the story of Lakewood isn't about one moment that broke everything. It's about a long drift, step by step, away from the cross, and toward something easier to hear, something safer, something softer. And once you notice that drift, it becomes impossible to ignore. Because every controversy that came later, every criticism, every headline, points back to the same hidden turn. Lakewood didn't fall in the way most people imagine. There was no single breaking point, no dramatic moment that sent the entire church crashing down. Instead, what happened was more subtle, and in many ways, more dangerous. The collapse began the moment the message changed. Not openly, not boldly, but quietly. A shift from a gospel built on sacrifice to a message built on self-comfort. A shift from the weight of the cross to the glow of positivity. And while that shift filled seats, it also hollowed something out. What used to confront people began to only encourage them. What used to challenge them began to reassure them. And over time, the heart of the message, what gave the church its strength, was pushed aside for something smoother and easier to sell. This video isn't about attacking Lakewood. It's about understanding why the foundation started to crack, why critics call it a collapse, even as the building still stands, and why a church that once shaped millions is now facing questions it can't easily ignore. Because when comfort replaces conviction, the cost doesn't show up right away, but it always shows up. Before the shift, Lakewood Church looked very different. It began as a small, traditional congregation led by Joel Osteen, a pastor known for direct teaching, strong doctrine, and a clear focus on the cross. The message was simple but firm. Faith came with struggle, sacrifice, and surrender. People didn't come for a show. They came because the church felt grounded, steady, and rooted in something bigger than comfort. For decades, Lakewood grew slowly and steadily. Nothing flashy, nothing polished. Just a church built on deep conviction. Then the next generation stepped in. When Joel Osteen took leadership, the tone began to change. The sermons became lighter. The language became smoother. The focus shifted from hardship to hope, from repentance to reassurance. Attendance exploded, and the church moved into a massive arena, proof that the new message had mass appeal. But the bigger Lakewood became, the more it drifted from what it once was. The cross didn't disappear. It just grew quieter, overshadowed by a message that felt safer and more uplifting. And that quiet change would become the root of everything that followed. The shift didn't start with a loud announcement. It began with the tone of the sermons. Slowly, the message moved away from the harder parts of faith, sin, sacrifice, struggle, and towards something smoother. Instead of calling people to carry the cross, the church began telling them the cross was already behind them. Instead of wrestling with conviction, people were encouraged to focus on confidence. Hope replaced repentance, blessing replaced obedience, and comfort replaced challenge. The new message was easy to like. It felt warm, positive, and safe. People left each service feeling lifted, not confronted, encouraged, not shaken. And in a world filled with stress and pressure, comfort sold fast. Attendance rose. Streams grew. Books became bestsellers. But the more the message focused on the self, your dreams, your breakthrough, your success, the more the center of Christianity faded into the background. Critics started asking a hard question. If the cross is only mentioned, not taught, is it still the foundation? This wasn't a shift in style. It was a shift in substance. And that shift set off a chain reaction that no one could stop. The first signs of trouble didn't come from theology debates. They came from moments when the church's public image clashed with its message. One of the biggest shocks happened during Hurricane Harvey. When the city flooded and people searched for shelter, Lakewood faced intense backlash online. Critics claimed the doors stayed closed longer than they should have. The church later explained the situation, but the damage was done. To many, it felt like a symbol, comfort inside, while chaos raged outside. Then came smaller controversies that added fuel. Videos questioning how the church handled charity. Social media debates about whether large donations reached those who needed them most. Each incident created another crack in the polished exterior. None of these moments destroyed Lakewood, but each one raised the same uncomfortable question. Had the church grown so large, so protected, so comfortable, that it forgot how to serve in costly ways? And what made it worse was how these controversies lined up with the shift in message. The softer the sermons became, the louder the criticism grew, almost as if the outside world saw something the church wasn't ready to face. If the controversies raised questions, the scandals raised alarms. One of the most shocking moments came when a shooting took place inside Lakewood during a Sunday gathering. It wasn't the church's fault, but it shattered the image of the megachurch as a safe, protected space. For many, it marked a turning point. If even Lakewood, known for its calm, polished atmosphere, could face something this violent, what else was simmering beneath the surface? Then came stories about threats, arrests around the property, and rising concerns about how vulnerable such a massive crowd could be. These incidents painted a picture that clashed with the upbeat message preached from the stage. While the sermon spoke of peace and protection, reality showed cracks in the walls. These weren't scandals in the sense of moral failure. They were structural scandals, moments that exposed how fragile a giant system really is. And with each incident, the church's image as a safe haven of comfort became harder to maintain. But the most damaging part wasn't the incidents themselves. It was what they revealed, a church built on positivity, struggling to handle the darker moments that positivity can't fix. While controversies and incidents shook Lakewood on the outside, the deepest cracks came from the inside of the Christian world itself. Pastors, theologians, and longtime believers began speaking out, not about safety or charity, but about the message. They argued that Lakewood had traded the hard truth of the gospel for a smoother, softer version, one that made people feel good but didn't challenge them to grow. Critics pointed out how sermons focused on success, confidence, and personal breakthrough, while words like sin, repentance, and sacrifice faded into the background. Some called it cotton candy Christianity, sweet, easy to swallow, but offering no real strength. Others said Lakewood had shifted from being a church to becoming a brand, built on positivity instead of conviction. Former members echoed the same concerns. They described feeling inspired at first, but empty later. Encouraged, but unchanged. Many said the Comfort First message sounded good until life got hard, and then it had nothing deep to stand on. But the sharpest criticism came with a warning. When a church removes the cost of following Christ, it removes the heart of the faith itself. And that is the kind of collapse no building can hide. What happened at Lakewood wasn't random. It wasn't even unique. It followed a pattern seen in megachurches across the country. When a church becomes massive, tens of thousands in the seats, millions watching online, the message often shifts to match the scale. Hard truth doesn't fill arenas. Comfort does. Conviction doesn't sell books. Inspiration does. And when the crowd grows, the pressure to keep everyone happy grows with it. In a small church, the pastor knows the people. In a megachurch, the pastor knows the camera. The message adjusts. The tone gets lighter. The edges get softer. The cross becomes a background symbol instead of the core. Not because leaders set out to weaken it, but because comfort draws numbers, and numbers keep the machine running. Once a church reaches Lakewood's size, it becomes more than a ministry. It becomes an institution, a brand, a global platform that must stay appealing to survive. And in that environment, the temptation to avoid anything too heavy becomes strong. This isn't just Lakewood's story. It's the system's story. And once a church steps onto that path, turning back becomes harder than anyone expects. To be fair, Lakewood's story isn't only about drift or decline. Many people still find real comfort there. For some, the positive message is the first thing that gives them hope after years of hardship. Others say the church helped them rebuild confidence, restore families, or break out of despair. You can't ignore that impact. A message doesn't reach millions unless it speaks to something real inside people. And Lakewood does more than most critics admit. The church funds community programs, supports families in crisis, and gives thousands a place where they feel safe and encouraged. For many, positivity isn't a problem. It's a lifeline. Not everyone wants heavy theology. Some people need a gentle start. Even critics agree on one thing. Joel Osteen didn't set out to harm anyone. His tone has always been warm, kind, and hopeful. That sincerity is part of why people trust him. So the picture isn't simple. Lakewood hasn't collapsed in attendance or influence. The collapse people talk about is quieter, spiritual, not structural. And that's what makes the debate so complicated. Because if comfort helps millions, is it really a problem? Or is the real issue what comfort slowly replaces? When you step back and look at Lakewood's story, a pattern becomes clear. The church didn't fall because of a single mistake. It drifted because comfort slowly became the center. A gentle message drew millions, but it also pushed aside the harder parts of faith, the parts that shape people, stretch people, and anchor people when life turns dark. And in that quiet trade, something essential slipped out of view. But this isn't only about Lakewood. It's about every church, every movement, every institution that grows large enough to feel the pull of popularity. Once comfort becomes the goal, conviction becomes optional. And once conviction becomes optional, collapse doesn't come with a crash. It comes with a whisper. The real question isn't whether Lakewood changed. It's what that change reveals about modern faith itself, about what people want to hear and what they no longer want to carry. And if one of the biggest churches in America can drift away from the cross without noticing, what does that mean for everyone else? Because Lakewood may not be the last church to face this moment. It might only be the first, and the next shift may already be happening somewhere else.